Before we begin this course, let's talk a little bit about what old literature is. Most of you are afraid of old literature. Modern literature is easy. Modern literature sounds like the way we talk. But old literature sounds differently. And those differences are not just because the vocabulary is different. Oh, I think there's airplanes flying over my house. It sounds like we're being invaded. The old literature is made up of patterns, and we call these patterns conventions. Now, each period, like fashion, chooses what it likes and dislikes. And these conventions are associated with rhetoric. And rhetoric at this period is the rules or prescriptions for good writing. You'll always see the term eloquence in poetry and prose at this period. Now, once you understand the conventions, both in terms of content and also form, reading Old English will be easy because you'll approach the text with certain expectations. So let's get a taste of what to expect by looking at Shakespeare's most famous sonnet.
Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy internal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee.
Super famous, right? And you have an idea of what the content is about, and that's how most of you have approached literature and poetry before. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? That first line, what does that mean? It means that he's about to use comparisons. And what is a comparison? A comparison is an example of poetic language. It's a trope, and this trope in this case would be the simile. You, the person he loves, and we'll talk about the complications of that you when we actually look at Shakespeare's sonnets, but that you, the person you love, is like the summer. But what's the problem with the summer? Summer's lease hath all too short a date. Summer doesn't last, right? Winter comes. But what does the poet promise? He promises that the person he loves, that you, will not be diminished by an oncoming winter. In other words, by aging. How can he make her or him, the person he loves, the person you love, how can you make the person you love stop the flow of time? Well, that's what poetry is. It's all found in the final volta. The volta is the rhymed couplets at the end of the sonnet. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, as long as people exist, so long lives this. And this thing he's referring to is the poem. So long as this poem exists, this gives life to thee. In other words, the poem he's written for the person he loves will last forever. Time may destroy their physical beauty, but the poem will immortalize that original beauty, that original summertime beauty. I mentioned that there were rhymed couplets. Well, that's a feature of a particular pattern, and that pattern is called a sonnet. Now, a sonnet is a genre associated with the Renaissance. Now, genres are forms that organize a text in expected ways, and in that sense, they are repeatable. They are forms that are called upon to do something. But you don't know what a sonnet is right now. A sonnet is a 14-line poem, and you can count the poems. I can tell you that this particular sonnet is called a Shakespearean sonnet, and it has a particular form as well that organizes the sonnet's soundscape. In this case, the pattern is made up of quatrains, and quatrains are a stanza of 4 lines. So you can find them by looking at the rhyme scheme. Day, temperate, May, date. Date and temperate, that they rhyme, but that's an example of where Elizabethan pronunciation differs from our modern American pronunciation. So A, B, that's what we call the quatrain. How do I know it's a quatrain? Because the next word is shines, and that changes. Shines, dimmed, declines, untrimmed. Notice that each rhyme is given a letter. Fade, ost, shade, grossed. And then it ends with a rhymed couplet. See thee. The evocation of summertime introduces us to another pattern, and this is called a commonplace or topos. Now, a commonplace or topos is a theme, an idea, a setting, or an image that is repeated over and over again throughout a period. So when you evoke summer, you are evoking a topos, and that topos is what we call the locus amoenus, which means the pleasing place. Whenever you see a poem about the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees in the springtime, that's the locus amoenus. Don't be surprised when you run into these images. A topos supplies repeatable ideas. Older conventional literature is all about reworking the same themes in different ways, okay? It's looking for novelty in what is already been said. Does that make any sense? You're looking for pleasure through expectations that may be changed a little, turned a little. Now, there's another repeatable element, and this is the part that makes old literature feel different from modern literature, and this is usually where the problems come about, and that is what we call figures of rhetorics, or we also call them the flowers of rhetoric, or colors. Let me show you a couple of these figures. Figures are particular patterns of language that stylistically transform our more natural uses of language in prescribed ways. Let me show you a few. These are figures of repetition. Ploki is a simple repetition of a word or phrase separated with words in between. These are real things. Shakespeare knew these things. More and more. Another example of ploki, fair and fair. Now, if you add the fair on line 10, then this fair and this fair and this fair become traductio, and traductio is where you repeat words across multiple lines. Let's find another example where ploki becomes complicated. Lives and life, and that repetition of the root of the word is what we call polyptoton. We see another example of polyptoton with traductio. Summers, summers, and then we have summer. There is also repetition along the edges of the lines. And. We call this an anaphor. It's the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of the line. Nor and nor. And finally, so long, so long. There's another figure. It's called alliteration. And what that is the repetition of a consonant sound. Chance and changing. Alliteration spreads out throughout the poem. And this is a sort of Middle English influence on poetry. Shall, get shake, get short, get shines, get shall, and shade. Where's my, there is another shall right there. That was 9. Shall. All of this adds color to a poem. And does it relate to meaning? Who's to say? That's the purpose of interpretation. The colors and the flowers and the figures, those signal something deep within you, that poetry is happening. And I call these sounds audio special effects. And for an Elizabethan audience at this time, they were essential. Poetry could not sound like normal language. So today's poems, the kind of poem perhaps you write in your own diary, would not be considered poetry in those days. That kind of poetry that we write would have sounded just boring to them. Now, there's another expectation you should look at. It's how you transform the normal word order of English into a poetic word order. We call this poetic inverted syntax. Remember, English has a particular word order: subject, predicate, that's verb, and object. Now, they picked up something from Latin, which allows you to put words in any order along the sentence, because the endings tell you what the function is for the word. The inverted syntax is here. Sometimes too hot, the eye of heaven shines. And you can see that sometimes too hot is the adverb, eye of heaven is the noun, and shines is the verb. In normal conventional English, the line would be sometimes the eye of heaven shines too hot. But for Shakespeare, that's not poetic enough. Part of that reason is we have to take into account the next pattern, which is meter. Now, we're going to talk a lot about meter in this course because it helps you understand how a poetic line is organized using weak and strong syllables to create a kind of rhythm. But just let's go for the most basic one. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see. And could you hear a little pause between breathe and or? That little pause is called a caesura. You can hear the caesura as well in the final one. So long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So now let's put it all together and listen to the poem.
Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines the time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee.
Alright guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell.